Thank you very much, Peter. Could I acknowledge the Governor and Mrs Scarce and all of the other distinguished guests that are here this evening. Thank you all for coming to hear my thoughts on a subject that's dear to my heart and I think is important for the future of our country. And thanks also, Uncle Lewis, for your welcome to country. As soon as you told me your story, I remembered one of my stories from my student days at Oxford University, when one of the final year examinations for philosophy had the question, "Is this a question?" And one of the students who'd spent most of his time drinking gin and tonic, playing croquet, punting up the river, the Isis, replied in his answer, "Well, if it is, this is an answer." I feel very honoured tonight to be able to deliver the annual Hawke Lecture and to follow such a distinguished list of lecturers before me. But firstly, let me reflect upon Bob Hawke, whose name, of course, is very much part of this lecture. Bob acted as an inspiration to many Australians of my generation. In fact, in reflecting upon what I was going to say for this lecture, I remembered an essay I wrote in economics when studying at the University of Western Australia on the subject of resale price maintenance. And many of you would remember that Bob campaigned on this issue as the ACTU advocate and then president. I was particularly interested in his view that trade unions ought to expand their horizons to take on issues like the collusive practices of big business and their impact on Australian consumers. Already we can see developing here what was to become the Labor case for a more competitive Australia and therefore a more productive Australia. In fact, by engaging and involving the trade union movement in economic reform, Bob Hawke restored Labor's status as an international leader in social democratic thinking and practice, a position it had held, along with New Zealand, in the early years of the 20th century. Speaking tonight also allows me to remind us all of the energy and commitment that were displayed during the years of the Hawke government. Serious economic and tax reform, wide-ranging social reform, and some decisions to protect the environment, major decisions, most notably stopping the construction of the Franklin Dam. These reforms were order of the day. Hawke and his ministers managed government well and had an eye to politics, but weren't afraid to take risks in the interests of a better and more compassionate Australia. When it was necessary, they took a lead and fought for their proposed reforms. Indeed, it is to these themes of leadership, engagement and reform that I intend to return later in this lecture. Firstly, let me outline the terms of my lecture. My focus tonight is on politics and political systems. I don't hold the view that Australian political debate should just be about economics. The economic debate is crucially important, and I strongly support a continuing program of micro and macroeconomic reform to ensure our economy is internationally competitive and efficient. We can ill afford to be complacent about productivity and the legal, human and physical infrastructure needed to support its improvement. The truth is, of course, that there are a range of issues that need to be addressed if we're to secure the future of our nation. The economics of productivity is one. Others include foreign and trade policies, the way Australia presents itself to the world, the way it's seen in the world, our approach to education, health and welfare. Is our system operating to guarantee equal opportunity? Or have we as a nation become complacent about our national commitment to fairness for all people? And of course, our policies for climate change and environmental renewal, our agenda for population immigration, and, importantly, religious and cultural diversity. These are all important issues. Some are pressing issues, and some are evolutionary by their nature, needing long-term and persistent attention. What then of political reform? What then of the question of the way we are governed? Some say we should leave such questions to one side while we get on with the real issues mentioned above. To argue that our nation is incapable of debating and acting on political reform at the same time as it moves forward with economic and other reforms is to underestimate the capacities and misrepresent the interests of the electorate. What happens in politics is understood to be important and seen to be in need of repair. Politics is not an issue that can or should be avoided. Political reform can mean many things, ranging from changes to our constitution, to changes to parliamentary practice and behaviour, to changes to our electoral system. We may seek changes to the formal arrangements under which we're governed, or changes of the culture under which underpin the formal arrangements we have. Whatever the proposals for change, they will need to be assessed not just for their guarantee of extra responsiveness and accountability, but also for their capacity to promote good and effective government. On to the attitude of the electors. The attitude that electors take to our system and the politicians that run it is important. Our electors may be disillusioned and apathetic. They might be opting out. On the other hand, they may be supportive and energetic in their citizenship. If they feel confident about and trust the system, making important and necessary changes is going to be easier, even if still difficult. What is needed is an atmosphere of trust that makes it possible for governments to tackle issues that they may otherwise seek to avoid. Thus, the title of my lecture tonight, Rethinking Australian Politics, Engaging the Disenchanted. The questions I seek to answer are as follows. What do we mean by disenchantment with Australian politics? How extensive is that phenomenon? Who are the disenchanted? What form is their disenchantment taking? And is it the same thing as disengagement? Do disenchantment and/or disengagement matter? And if yes, what solutions have been proposed? Will these solutions address the issues as intended, or are they based on a merely impressionistic and largely faulty view of what is really happening in our society? And finally, given my answers to these questions, what is the way forward for Australian politics? To assist me in this endeavour, I commissioned Ipsos Marketing to engage in some research. They used a sample demographic profile to ask 1,040 electors the following questions. How important is it to you personally which party is in government? What do you think is the best thing about Australian politics? What do you think is the worst thing about Australian politics? If you had a magic wand, what one thing would you change about Australian politics? And finally, thinking about politics over the last decade, which federal politician do you most admire? I will attach the overall findings from this research as an appendix to my lecture, but just to give you a quick summary of what came back. The survey found that 73% of respondents still thought that it was very or somewhat important to them which party was in government. So the parties do matter for 73% of those polled. However, the younger the respondent, the less likely they were to report that the party in government was very important to them. While 27% said there was absolutely nothing good about Australian politics, only 4.2% reported that everything was bad. Interesting. As Ipsos reported to me, cynicism has not yet triumphed. However, there is a disenchantment with the parties, the politicians and the culture they support, particularly in terms of in-house fighting, negativity, honesty and accountability. The theme of freedom featured prominently in the comments of those interviewed. Freedom of choice, freedom of speech, the freedom to vote. This being said, More reported compulsory voting to be the best thing about Australian politics, 3.9%, than reported it the worst thing, 2.9%. And recently, of course, we've had other evidence that compulsory voting is supported by the Australian electorate. Of politicians in the last decade, most admired were John Howard and Kevin Rudd. John Howard with 31.4% and Kevin Rudd with 24.3%. Most desired by way of change was honesty and integrity in politics. Electors do like their politicians to stand up for what they believe in, even if they disagree. Now, I include this research not to indicate that my argument is based upon it. In fact, quite the reverse, as you'll see as I proceed through my argument, but as background to the discussion about disenchantment and disengagement. Such findings don't tell us everything. They still require interpretation. And I believe one of the key issues that we need to address is not the way we interpret these findings intellectually, but the way political leaders try to shape the debate in our community and digest such findings in the way that they do that. It's been a remarkable year in Australian politics. A Prime Minister deposed by his own party, an election that produced a hung parliament and a minority government. For the first time, the Greens have captured a seat in a general election for the House of Representatives, and there are now 4 independents in that chamber as well. The resurgent Nationals in Western Australia gained a seat at the expense of the Liberals, proving once again the power of this city versus country narrative in Australian politics.